Well, last week we kicked off this Explore God series, and I want to, thank you for your response to it. It's been pretty incredible, the conversations that have gotten started. Last week we started with the question about the purpose of life, and we had a really nice crowd come back on Sunday evening for a further discussion about that. So I'm really excited about that. I guess in some ways what I said last week when I said we're taking the next 7 weeks is now just a countdown. So let me say it like this. The next 6 weeks will be a holistic approach to exploring God. And remember what I mean by holistic. I really hope that this will be both intellectual and practical. Some of the questions lean more one direction than the other, and tonight's happens to be a little more intellectual, but I think it'll still be practical. Another idea between how it's holistic is that it's a lecture. I'm glad you're here to listen over the next 30 minutes, but to carry these conversations forward in a lab is so important. And so if you're really exploring, if you're trying to sort out the meaning of life, the purpose of life, or who God is, or does he exist, then to come back to a conversation on Sunday night, or I know some of you are taking this and having these conversations with your friends, so powerful. The other part of holistic is that, of course, we're in a church setting, so a lot of us are already followers of Jesus. But this conversation of exploration is open to people, whether they're followers of Jesus or not. You might be an atheist or an agnostic. You might be someone who's skeptical. You might be of a different religion or a different religious heritage. I'm glad that you're here because we're going to explore this together. And it's no secret that I'm a follower of Jesus, and I'm interested in leading you to at least understand the answers to these questions from the perspective of a follower of Jesus, but I hope that everyone can go on this journey, because the other part of this is we're going to explore God. I really believe everyone has questions. Now, I'll tell you just a little bit about my experience. I can only tell the truncated version of the story right now, and I'll tell it more in later weeks, but there was a season in my life in my mid-20s when I went through a serious questioning of my own faith. Some writers refer it, this may sound like a little dramatic, as a dark night of the soul. And I don't mean to paint a dramatic picture for you, but it was a time in my life where I had to, more seriously than I ever had, ask the question, am I only a follower of Jesus? Am I only a Christian because that's the home I grew up in? Isn't it true that if I had grown up in a Muslim home, I'd be Muslim? If I had grown up in a Jewish home, I'd follow Judaism? If I had grew up in a Hindu home, like what chance did I really have to choose anything else? And so it sent me on an exploration of what is true. And I want to honor, all through this series, the simple pursuit of truth. Because as I tell my friends who are willing to explore all the time, if Christianity isn't true, I want to know. So we might as well just explore truth and let it lead us where it takes us, and then we will deal with the implications of that, but at least we'll deal with it in the midst of the truth. Now, in my story, I genuinely explored other faith systems. There was not a proclivity inside of me to explore atheism. That wasn't something that I have really in my life ever considered might be true. It doesn't make sense to me. But one of the things that I've discovered is that even though it's not my proclivity to be drawn toward atheism or wondering if a God even exists, I might be unique in that way. In fact, a little history here for you about exploring God. In the last 15 to 20 years, the rise of people who consider themselves atheists, the rise of people who had considered themselves no longer religiously affiliated, has dramatically increased. And if you start to trace your way back to what's going on within our culture, there's no single answer to it, but there are some movements that I think are obvious. Some of you were alive when 9/11 happened. These days, we have a whole crowd at Suncrest who wasn't even alive or doesn't have a memory of that. But shortly after 9/11 happened, you may remember that there was an initial surge in kind of coming back to God, back to church, back to religion. That initial surge lasted about 2 weeks. Honestly. People flowed back into churches. The attendance at churches the week after 9/11 was beyond Easter and Christmas numbers. It was incredible. And week 2 was off from that a little bit, and by week 3, everything was back to normal. And there are some critics, maybe fairly, who say people came back to church looking for an answer, and they didn't find one. And then they went on looking somewhere else. And at about that same time, a gentleman named Sam Harris was shopping a book to certain publishers. The title of the book, I'll put the picture up here, was called The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. Sam Harris is an atheist. He's one of what's called the new atheists. And honestly, when he was shopping this book, at first he didn't find a market for us. Publisher after publisher after publisher turned him down. What publisher wanted to be responsible for publishing a book about atheism? Until he finally found a publisher, and it ended up on the New York Times bestseller list for almost 40 weeks in a row. Now, Sam Harris's book generated a lot of conversation. He actually got a lot of nasty notes and emails from Christians and others, and he wrote a follow-up book to it that's scathing to followers of Jesus called Letter to a Christian Nation, where he just pulls apart all the cultural things that Christians do that make no sense in the midst of their true worldview. This was the beginning of a movement, and shortly after that there was another book published by a guy named Richard Dawkins. It's called The God Delusion. In fact, a week ago I told you that I had a friend of mine who I found out he was an atheist, and I said, hey, we're going to have a conversation about this. We ended up having multiple conversations about it, and he said, how about this? He said, will you read a book? I said, I'll read a book if you read a book. So I gave him the book, Mere Christianity. I wanted him to read that, and he gave me this book. I have it right here. And if you read the book, The God Delusion, what you'll find is that Richard Dawkins is an atheist, and he's kind of an evangelistic atheist. He's trying to help other people become atheists. He's trying to rally people to that cause. Not long after that book was published, there was another book published by a guy named Christopher Hitchens. The name of that book was God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And these three authors and thinkers, along with many others, have shaped some of the intellectual conversation. Now, you may have never heard of any of these. You may have never been on a college campus where they lectured or anything like that. But my guess is you've been influenced by them, or at least your children or your grandchildren have. And the influence is not necessarily that someone became an atheist. The influence is that as people considered how the world is put together and who God is and how real He is and how He interacts with the world, there were a certain group that potentially became atheists, but there was a large group that just decided the religion that they grew up with, the faith and the God that they grew up with, no longer sufficiently held the answers to life. And so while they may not say they are atheists, they start to function in a way that is disconnected from faith. For some of you, that's your own story. Almost all of us know someone whose story that is. In fact, I think Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion actually gives us a fairly helpful graph that you could place yourself on when it comes to the spectrum from full theist to full atheist. I'm going to show it to you here on the screen. Think about this, and you can put yourself in this group. Strong theism, right? This is someone who would say they are certain of God, 100% for sure. This is actually a quote by Carl Jung. He says, I do not believe, I know. I don't know if you'd think of yourself like that. There's the sense of a de facto theist. Again, not necessarily Christian. This isn't any particular religion. This is just the idea of whether God exists or not. Someone would say, I strongly believe in God, and I live my life on the assumption that He's there. This would be a person of faith. They would say that they believe, and they try to orient their life on the basis of that faith. You can see how it starts to go down the chain, right? Leaning theism, I'm uncertain, but I'm inclined to believe in God. Middle category, impartial, which I call spineless. Just my take on it. God's existent, and I just want to live in the middle of everything, equally equiprobable. That's a good Richard Dawkins word. Then it goes the other direction with all the same categories. Leaning atheist, de facto atheist, maybe that. I think God is very improbable. Not totally sure. Can't prove for sure that God doesn't exist, but I live my life on the assumption that He's not there. And then strong atheist. Someone who definitively and with certainty says, I know there is no God. So I'm curious where you would put yourself on that spectrum. And this is a place to be honest, perfectly honest. If you want to know where I put myself on that spectrum, I am squarely in the category of de facto theism. I am not, in this category, a strong theist. I actually don't believe it's possible to prove the existence of God or to, in an intellectual way, be certain of the existence of God, but I do believe it and feel like I have good reasons to believe it and then orient my life that way. What's happened as the undergirding of atheism has taken root, especially in academic and college campus settings, is that people have moved down this chain, sometimes swimming in the lower half of it, and you might be right. You might be right. But I want people to pay attention to the idea that when you move away from a belief in God, you do move toward something else. And I want to talk just a little bit today because I want us to explore this together. I want you to have the freedom to think all the way through this. And I do have a vision today that if I could help you move up the chain toward the top of the list, that would be my desire for you. So before we dive into the reasons behind this, let's at least back up just a little bit and say, your beliefs in God, what you believe to be true about God or not to be true about God, are shaped in a certain way. And I don't know if you've ever thought about why you believe what you do, how they were shaped along the way. Let me give you 4 images that shaped how you believe in God or don't believe in God right now. Here's the first one. Teaching from others. Almost all of us as children were told something about God. You may have grown up in a home that didn't believe. You were told that God didn't exist. You may have grown up in a home that did believe. You may have had Sunday school teachers, and they taught you something about God. This is very fascinating because what almost always happens in people is they have a childhood version of what they believe that later gets tested. When your childhood version of what you believed is no longer strong enough to hold up to the intellectual realities that you now face. And one of 2 things happens. Either you come across someone who has a substantial enough and robust enough understanding of their faith that your childhood faith gets reinforced and becomes stronger because now you have robust answers to what used to be elementary questions. Or, this very commonly happens, you come across someone who has a view of God who is different than your childhood faith. They present it in a way that is stimulating, seems to have an intellectual coherence to it that your childhood faith didn't have. And then, because your first-generation faith can't handle the second-generation questions, it will actually start to erode someone's faith and their understanding. This is how we come to our beliefs that we have. It's interesting to pay attention to what that is. Second, our experience with authority figures. I believe that this is one of the dominating reasons for why many people have the view of God that they do. God, by his very definition, if he's real, is the authority figure. He's over all, and if you grew up in a religious home, this was only reinforced to you that God is in charge. He's the one who gives the commands. He's the authority. And by association, mostly subconsciously, we start to relate our view of God to the actual authority figures that we have in our lives. For most of us, our father, for better or for worse, becomes an association that we have in our understanding of God. It's not just your father, though. It's certainly your mother. It's maybe a teacher or a coach or a pastor or a priest that you had, someone who seemed to be an authority. And depending on how they treated you, depending on how you interacted with them, it shaped how you view God. When my dad died a few years ago, I had the great privilege of doing the eulogy at his funeral. And after all the little stories that we told and funny memories that we had and meaningful things that I wanted to say, I told everyone at the end that the greatest gift my father gave to me is that he established for me a healthy view of who God was just by his nature. Praise the Lord. That's who he was. He wasn't perfect, and I know that. He didn't have to be perfect, but he was the kind of person who advocated for me, who defended me, who provided for me, who encouraged me, who loved me no matter what, who disciplined me when I needed. He actually gave me a pretty accurate view of it is my understanding of God. That's beautiful if you had a dad like I had. And sometimes it's something that's quite a challenge to overcome if you didn't have a dad like I had.
Amen.
Third part that teaches us how God is shaped is the experiences that create dissonance. You know, it's one thing to kind of go through your life and have an image of who God is and then have everything line up with that. The real interesting times in our lives are when we have a certain view of God and then we experience something that doesn't line up with our view of God. In our actual experience with our understanding of God to that point in our lives. I see this happen all the time, both positively and negatively in my experience. So maybe you know someone like this. They would have said, I'm an atheist, I don't believe, and then came the birth of their first child. And there's something that happened, and the beauty of what's happening, the responsibility, the relationship, all that happens with the birth of their first child, where they think, you know what, I said I didn't believe in God, but this experience right here, that doesn't add up with what I believed up to this point. Of course, on the flip side, sometimes has a negative effect on people's experience with God. Maybe you grew up with an understanding of God, a misunderstanding, I would suggest, that says, God will never give you more than you can handle. And if you think that's who God is, God's someone who will never give me more than I can handle. And then, at a point in your life, you were overwhelmed with something that was more than you could handle. That creates a dissonance inside of you, and you think, oh, maybe God isn't real. We don't tend to think, maybe I was taught incorrectly about God.
Amen.
But you will get your view shaped of God whenever a dissonance gets created with your current experience. Here's the fourth thing. This is a challenge. Your experience with religious people. A lot of people have their view of God shaped because of their experience with you. I mean, if you're a religious person, if you at any point, are willing to share with people, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus, then they're going to look at you and say, oh, that must be what that must be what the Christian God is like. It's a significant responsibility. You all should own it, responsibly. But the truth is, we should also all in our own experience say, maybe I shouldn't judge God by the behavior of people who claim to be his followers.
Amen.
It was Gandhi who was once pursuing whether he would become a follower of Jesus or not, and his conclusion in the end was, I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. And he decided not to become a follower of Jesus. Not because of who Christ was or even who the scriptures claim God to be, but because of how the community that represented that God behaved. Now, I guess I'm just suggesting to you that the view you have of God, of whether he exists or not, of whether he is real, of how he exists if he exists, is shaped by all these things. And we should step back long enough to explore whether that's true or not. So the question for today is simply, does God exist? Does God exist? And there will be messages later in this series that aim that more precisely, to say if God does exist, which religion is true, which version of God that seems to be on the board out there is accurate. But we're just backing this one up all the way to say, no, this is just a simple question. Does God exist?
Amen.
Now, the scriptures speak about this like this. Here's what Paul writes in the book of Romans. He says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
Amen, brother.
From the Christian standpoint, we understand that God created the world and that we should actually be able, just from the observation of the world around us, if we would take our time to look around, to say, oh, there is a God. It finishes like this. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. And this is talking about our propensity as human beings to take our eyes off of the Creator and keep from looking up, and instead be so fascinated by the creation that we give our heart and our time and our energy and our money to earthly experiences. That's what we tend to worship.
Yes.
So, when I'm trying to reason out whether there is a God or not, this is what I try to do. I think there has to be a source for certain things in this world. And the things that I'm going to describe to you, I think there's an answer within the Scriptures as a source for these things. The first one is the nature of choice.
Yes.
If you're a follower of Jesus and embrace the Scriptures, and actually this is true of many, many religions, the idea is that human beings actually have a free will, that we have a consciousness to us, and within that consciousness is the ability to choose yes or no, to choose left or right, to say that we have a free will to make choices. We can make great choices, we can make horrible choices, we can make godly or ethical choices, and we're free to make rebellious choices. If you are someone who is an atheist, who says God does not exist, then essentially all the leading atheists agree on this, that there is not really any choice. You are a scientific, very sophisticated and very complex body of molecules that react in scientific and kind of machine-oriented ways to the biology of you and the biology of the person next to you and the biology of creation around you. This is not really debated. Sam Harris, who wrote that book, Letter to a Christian Nation, actually on his podcast, he'll reflect on this and he'll say, you know what? I remember getting all these nasty letters from Christians in the United States, and he said, at first I remember feeling kind of angry at them. He said, but then I remembered they can't help it. There's a determinism. There is no choice in the atheist world. That's his sense. Stephen Hawking, one of the greatest scientific minds of the last century, just recently died of ALS. This guy is brilliant, and he's an atheist. There's a lot of smart people who choose the path of atheism. I want to acknowledge that. And they come to these conclusions. In fact, in writing once, Stephen Hawking wrote this. He was, I think, trying to be funny. He said, I've noticed that even people who claim that everything is predestined look before they cross the road. And then he goes on to say, but that's just predestined too. That's determined. That you can't lay blame or responsibility for any human choice or will if you take God out of the equation, because you have no source for that at all. One of the things, again, that I want to do in an experience like this is to say, hey, atheism, it could be true. It could be true. If you want to embrace it, I just ask that you embrace it in its full consistency and say, yeah, that's what I believe. I believe everything is predetermined. Second, when I reason out whether there's a God, a source is needed for the nature of value. Now, value is sometimes said in different ways. Sometimes people frame it as ethics. Sometimes people frame it as morality, the nature of right and wrong. And I absolutely believe that the case that there is God-given morality, God-given right and wrong, is really the only way to start to pull together something that makes sense. If there is a right and wrong that lives outside of the system that is attached to the system, otherwise everything's determined within the system. I don't know if you've heard someone say this to you lately. I had an experience recently where someone said to me, well, that's your truth. That's not my truth. That's your truth. That's not my truth. I actually had this conversation with a really, really sharp high school student just a couple of months ago. And I thought, okay, we'll just play that out a little bit. Like, let's think about what we're saying. Because that would be kind of the atheist worldview, that you have a truth and I have a truth. There's no outer source of truth, so we all have to figure that out ourselves. Just for a moment, if we took the word truth away and we put in the word justice, I start to think, how does that actually work? You have your justice, and I have my justice, and you have your justice, and you have your justice. The system doesn't work like that. The notion that there is actually a right and there is actually a wrong, and it's not just personal to you, but it's a part of the system, is essential. And from the scriptures, from the Christian perspective, this is how Paul writes about this in Romans. He says, now the they here is important. It's actually the Gentiles. So Paul was Jewish in his upbringing. The Christian faith started out with Jewish people. Jesus was a Jewish person himself. They started to become Christians. And then they looked at all the people who weren't Jewish, who didn't have the religious structure that Judaism had. Judaism already had a God that brought morality. But he's saying, look at all these people who don't have a God that brings about morality. They show that the requirements of the law are actually written on their hearts. You were created with a morality. Their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times defending them. He's saying, pay attention to it. Every one of us knows there's a right and a wrong. We can disagree on particular applications of that at times, but no one believes murder is right. We all have this agreement, and it comes from an outside source. If there is no God, then you do have your justice, and I have my justice. And I think the equation gets very complicated. Third, when I reason out whether there's a God, a source is needed for the nature of beginnings. Now, beginnings fits a lot of different categories. Philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, they're the ones who thought of these terms. They said, but what is the prime reality? What is the unmoved mover? What is the source of the beginning of thought and consciousness? A lot of times we think of this in terms of physical creation and the idea that there must be a designer, someone who created this world with the complexity that it has because they're intelligent and because they put it together. I don't know if you've ever looked at the world and thought, hey, there's a creator there. One of the pictures I used to show people when I was talking about this was just a picture of Mount Rushmore. Now I'm going to show you a little different picture of Mount Rushmore, because this is a picture of me and my family in front of Mount Rushmore a couple of summers ago. But here's what I would do. I would tell people, I said, hey, look at Mount Rushmore, right? Does anyone think that came about randomly? Mount Rushmore, like, hey, we were driving through South Dakota, and can you believe it? Can you believe it? I mean, I don't know if you see it, but on that mountain, it looks like there's faces there. Isn't it wild that mountain, it just grew, and that one looks a lot like George Washington, right? Everybody looks at that and says, well, of course, that doesn't occur naturally. There was someone who designed that and worked on it and crafted it, and of course, you're right. Things like that don't just happen out of midair.
Very true.
I'm telling you, don't just look at the four faces on the mountain. Look at the four faces in the picture. I can promise you they are way more complex than that mountain. And they didn't just happen. This is the point. To believe that things just emerged, just happened out of spontaneity with no design, no intelligence, which is the view of an atheist. You have to figure that out. Now, this is interesting. Richard Dawkins, when he was writing The God Delusion, I think what he was trying to do with the sentences that I'm going to read to you here is that he was trying to kind of spark imagination and beauty attached to evolution or attached to a non-creator. I think that's what he was trying to do. But I just want you to listen to the words that he writes as an atheist. This is his view. He says, think about it. On one planet, and possibly only one planet, in the entire universe, molecules that would normally make nothing more complicated than a chunk of rock. So there's a group of molecules that make nothing more complicated than a chunk of rock. Those molecules, they gather themselves together into chunks of rock-sized matter, of such staggering complexity that they're capable of running and jumping and swimming and flying and seeing and hearing. He's talking about animals. He says, isn't this beautiful? This is how it worked. There used to be just molecules of rock, and then somehow that became alive, and isn't that amazing? And then he goes on. He says, not just flying and seeing and hearing, then they capture and they eat each other, eating other such animated chunks of complexity, capable in some cases of thinking and feeling and falling in love with yet other chunks of complex matter. How romantic. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of him. I'm genuinely not. I think Richard Dawkins is smarter than I am. Do the IQ thing. He's smarter than I am. I'm just saying that he's the one who says that if you're to be an atheist, to not believe in God, this is the answer. That's how it came to be. The scriptures suggest something else. This is Psalm 90. It says, Lord, you've been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Amen. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
Amen.
See, this is the challenge. I'll have kids ask me. Kids have great questions. They'll say, hey, if God created the world, who created God? It's a great question. It's a great question. The answer is no one created God. That God, in my understanding of him, is the only thing that has existed forever and ever. Amen. And the point is, you actually need to figure out something that existed forever and ever. Otherwise, the questions never end. Because if I could answer for you who created God, your next question is going to be, who created that thing or that person? To have an understanding of atheism is to suggest that something came out of nothing, that we skipped to life from something that was without life and without help. And in my way of thinking, it becomes more reasonable to believe that there is a God than there isn't. Last piece. When I reason out whether there's a God, a source is needed for the nature of identity. This is about who you are and who I am. And I believe, from the Scripture's perspective, that you have an identity. Amen. That you have a being. You are a child of God. There's a relational element to it. But the leading atheists would say, not true. Christopher Hitchens is one of these new atheists, and sadly, a number of years ago, he died of cancer. And he did something that I respect. He held his view consistently all the way through his death. And he would write about it. He actually kind of did a journal called Mortality of this process of dying. And he talks about conversations he would have with his doctors. And the doctors would constantly say to him, hey, here's the cancer's the issue, Mr. Hitchens, Dr. Hitchens. This is your body is acting this way. And he said, eventually I got so frustrated with him that I said this, I don't have a body, I am a body. I don't have a body, I am a body. The very notion of consciousness that exists outside the physical body, the notion that you have a mind, not just a brain, has its source in the notion that there's more than the physical world. That there is a deity, something that's divine. And we'll get in future weeks as to the nature of that particular deity and whether you would choose to believe in the Christian version of that deity. But without the deity, there is no have a body. The body is all you are. When the Apostle Paul was talking to people who were kind of exploring these big ideas of theology and philosophy and the top of Mars Hill in Acts 17, he actually wrote something that I think is beautiful. And I don't know, again, where you are in your faith, but if you'd be open to the idea that there is a God and he is personal, I would want you to hear what Paul said to these friends. Here's what he said. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven. And he doesn't live in temples built by human hands. That's what Paul at the time was looking around. He's up on the Areopagus. He's looking down at the city. He's like, yeah, there's a temple, there's a temple, there's a temple. People go to those temples to worship. You think God is in those temples? God is not in temples made by human hands. Amen. He himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. You're more than a body. You're more than a body. You're a person. And then he finishes this way. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any of us.
Amen.
Is there a God?
Yes.
I believe there is.
Yes.
I want you to think through this for yourself and think of the implications of yes or no. And of course, if you're willing to explore it and this makes sense to you, I want you to know that he wants you to seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, because he is not far from any one of you. Let me pray about that right now. God, thanks for your goodness to us, your love, the brains that you've given us so that we can understand intellectual things, and the hearts and I believe souls that you've given us that cause us to search and seek and find. God, I honor anyone in this room who would be thoughtful about this, who would like to discuss it more, who's on the journey of their own. And I pray, God, since I believe in you, that they would find you, knowing that you're not far from anyone. In Jesus' name.